Hello, my friends. Welcome back to another episode of the Shaman Circle. I'm your host, AB, and today we are talking all about reparenting your inner child. Now, today's episode is about rewriting stories and healing trauma that our younger selves experienced. There is this quote that always comes up when I think about our inner child. It's that quote of like, nobody gets out alive. And it's kind of true in our families, right? Nobody gets out of their families unscathed. Now, this is not a 20-minute rant of me shitting on everybody's parents. I promise you that is not the capacity that we are here in, my friends. That is not what this episode is about. But I do want to start us off by kind of normalizing that everybody's parents fucks them up in some way. That is part of the human experience. If not, there wouldn't be anything for us to heal. You know, we carry both the power and the wounds from generation to generation. And with enough awareness, you know, it's up to us to decide which wounds we heal in this lifetime and which ones we inflict on the next sector of our lineage. So it's kind of impossible for us to talk about the inner child and reparenting our inner child without talking about our parents. So take this all with a grain of salt. Please know I can only speak from my perspective, from my experience, from my family trauma, right? I don't know what family trauma or upbringing that you may have on that end. So, you know, sooner or later I might say something like, you know, we can give our parents some compassion, and that may not resonate with you. That's okay. This episode is still for you. I'd like to think that there's still wisdom to be had here. And let's see where the journey of the inner child takes us. But please know we'll be talking a bit about parenting while we reparent our inner child. Now, what even is the inner child? We need to define what that is before we can really talk about it, right? Our inner child is any past version of ourselves that holds meaning or value for some reason for our current self. You know, if we're talking from a Reiki standpoint, an energy standpoint, our inner child typically lives in our solar plexus, in our gut. You know, you've heard that term, trust your gut, or you've got a gut instinct. That is your inner child. It is the innocent, knowledgeable version of you that hasn't succumbed to society's need for perfection yet. That inner child, that sweet, innocent version of you typically lives in your solar plexus, in your gut, right? But that inner child is any version. You know, we use the term child loosely. It is the 6-year-old version of you, the 12-year-old, 16. You know, if you're someone who's in their 40s, 50s, 60s listening to this, it could be who you were 10 years ago. We use that term inner child loosely, but it's a past version of ourselves that holds meaning. Now, when we're talking about reparenting the inner child, we are probably reparenting a part of ourselves because there is hurt or harm or trauma there, right? We're working with the wounds of our past selves. And these wounds can come from a lot of different things, right? They can come from unmet needs in our family, from feeling like we were emotionally or physically neglected, physically or emotionally abused. Maybe we experienced chaos in our family. Maybe we had unmet expectations along with those needs, right? These wounds can come from so many different places. And if we look back enough, you can start to see patterns of those wounds within our different lineage, our different generations. Our ancestry, our lineage, we go through these cycles. Each generation has its own cyclical pattern. And that's why in this generation, so many of us are starting to heal things that, quite honestly, our parents never could, simply because they didn't have the capacity to. Right? Like at the time of this recording, I'm 32 years old. My parents are part of an older generation. They're in their 70s. I know people my age who have parents that are 20 years younger than mine in their 50s. I have a friend who's a decade older than me and her parents are in their 80s, right? So we find ourselves in like this adult child generation where we have parents anywhere from 50 to 80 years old, and that generation quite honestly, wasn't taught these things, wasn't taught about, typically wasn't taught about, right? Because I'm feeding into a stereotype here, but these older generations, where our ancestors and our parents and our grandparents come from, they weren't taught that speaking up for themselves or setting boundaries or, these types of things were okay. Like, we are a product of our environment, of our family, of our trauma, but that goes with our parents as well. They are a product of their parents' trauma. Many people of that generation weren't taught that it was safe to speak up. So many of our parents experienced very real physical abuse when they tried to speak up for themselves. This type of healing of setting boundaries and communicating on a deeper level, it was seen as taboo and weird and sometimes just straight up wrong for some of the generations that had come before us. And these wounds, right, when we're reparenting the inner child, what happened to us or what was bestowed upon us when we were children or when we were younger can absolutely affect who we are currently. And so these wounds that we're working with and we're trying to heal and nurture, they show up in adulthood in so many different ways. These inner child wounds can show up like self-doubt, like abandoning ourselves, abandoning our morals or our values or our boundaries for the sake of someone else's comfort. It looks like people pleasing. On the complete opposite side of that spectrum, it looks like hypervigilance, hyperindependence. I don't need no man. I can do this by myself, right? Like that, those are wounds of not getting the care, the needs, the patience, the compassion necessary when we were younger. So they show up in adulthood in so many different ways. And I touched on this for a moment, but to dive in a little deeper here, the concept of being this adult child, like I'm 32, but I'm still somebody's kid. My parents are still alive. I'm still their child, even though I am adult. These adult children, this generation we find ourselves in, we're in a very interesting position where, we do our best to love our parents and view our parents as, the flawed human beings that they are. And it's tough when we get to that point where, we're being asked to see our parents as human beings and not just parents, not just guardians, not just protectors, right? It's this very odd, very frustrating balance of seeing and being aware of their wounds while also trying to hold space and carry our own. And as adult children, it's a very delicate dance that we do, specifically when we are adult children who have parents who are still alive. There's this dance of how can I, reparent myself and give myself the validation that I need now and that I needed as a child, while actively finding grace and forgiveness for my aging parents who were doing the best with what they were given. It's a complex dance that we find ourselves doing in this generation. There's this tension between they did their best, or we'd like to think they did their best, and maybe that still wasn't enough, or maybe that wasn't what I needed as a child. And so with this duality of parenting our older parents or our aging parents and then parenting ourselves at the same time, we find ourselves often grieving some sort of fantasy or potential of what that relationship or that dynamic could have looked like. We get frustrated with what they could have done instead of what they did do. And then we have to ask ourselves, well, can we find love either way? Can we love the person as they are and not just for their potential or what they could have done? Now, I said this once before. I think it's worth repeating. Take me with a grain of salt with this, right? Because I'm talking about, showing love and grace and forgiveness and compassion and all of these lovely things to our parents, when on the other side of this camera, there may be someone listening who suffered very real physical, emotional, psychological harm from a parent. And so when I say, oh, can we love them and still accept their flaws, you may turn around and say, no, fuck you. My dad beat me when I was a kid and my mom was an alcoholic and enabled his behavior. And now at 35 years old, I'm trying to figure out what the fuck I'm supposed to do with my life with a broken family. I want to hold space for that. And that's a very specific example. I don't know who that's for or where that came from, but I recognize and respect the fact that my perspective is simply mine and it may not resonate with the experiences that you have. So although I would love to preach, love and compassion and grace for everybody, I recognize that that may not be feasible for some people. So only you know what you've experienced. What you've experienced and what you feel around it is valid. And when we talk about the complications of love and family, meet yourself with grace and take me with a grain of salt. All right. But ultimately, it's up to us to accept what our parents are capable of and what they aren't. A lot of this stuff is generational. Most of the people, the older generations who have come before us, quite honestly, don't have the capacity to sit in these deeper waters like we do, unless they were truly intent on breaking a curse within their generational link, right? Like the concept of sitting in our discomfort and facing our shadows and being intentional about that is not something that was necessarily taught to our parents' generation. Now we understand more the concept of the inner child. We're starting to get a grasp of the duality between being adult and being a child. But what does it mean? What does it look like to actually reparent yourself as an adult child? Well, it can look like a lot of different things in practice, right? A lot of times that looks like being patient with yourself. For some people who may have grown up in a more chaotic and less organized environment, maybe that looks like more discipline, more loving accountability with yourself. But that also looks like practicing joy, right? So many of us, especially those of us who travel this, quote unquote healer's path, we find ourselves on this path because we have a good amount of trauma to heal, which would then insinuate we probably didn't feel an abundance of joy when we were growing up. That's when all of the trauma was happening, right? And so when we talk about what does inner child healing look like in practice, it looks like practicing joy. It looks like skipping down the street for no good reason. It looks like turning on your favorite 90s station and singing at the top of your lungs on the way to work. It looks like, don't tell anybody I'm condoning this, but playing hooky and going to the beach instead of going to work one day and letting your inner child play in the sand and in the water. Like, so much of healing is so deep and dark and uncomfortable and scary and shadowy and all of these things, these heavy things, but healing is also joy. And if we bypass the experience of practicing joy, our inner child misses so much of that reparenting. Joy is such a big part of this work. How do we soothe ourselves in real time, right? We can practice the joy, but when we're not in joy, when we find our nervous system starting to act up and, oh God, I'm starting to feel a spiral coming on and the monkey mind's coming in, right? Like, how do we soothe ourselves? Maybe that looks like breathing deeply, breathing with intention, doing a box breath, counting 4 breaths in, holding for 4 breaths, exhale for 4, hold for 4. Maybe it's as simple as you breathe deeply and you literally focus on your nose, you focus on your nostrils, you find something safe for your brain to pinpoint itself to. If we're a little more advanced in healing, talk therapy, things like that, maybe that practice looks like naming the trigger, asking if it's yours, asking if it's true, right? Having that inner dialogue with yourself. Having that inner dialogue with yourself and imagining the other person is the 8-year-old version of you or the 12-year-old, whatever version of ourselves need that compassion in that moment. And as the name of the entire concept suggests, Reparenting yourself often looks like becoming the parent that you needed, whether that was who you needed for that version of you or the parent that you need in this moment, right? Maybe that looks like you affirming yourself, giving yourself the validation you may not have gotten when you were a kid. Maybe that looks like being more consistent with yourself, having some loving boundaries set with yourself. Maybe that looks like researching and seeking out mentorship for emotional literacy and resources for expanding and evolving your emotional intelligence, right? These are all a bunch of different things I can throw out at you, but ultimately you know what you need. And then, there's the everyday choices that we make in life. Like, yes, reparenting our inner child can be like a whole crash course, deep dive of shadow work, but it can also be simple everyday activities that help us heal, right? Reparenting your child looks like being mindful of the foods that you eat, the things that you consume, making sure you consume things for your body as fuel, but also tapping into that joy. What did you love to eat when you were a kid? Is that a part of your diet? The everyday choices look like how much rest we're allowing ourselves to have. Can we have a nap if we're tired? Are we in bed by a certain time? Are we waking up at a certain time? Are we being consistent with those? And a lot of these everyday choices, I don't know about you, but as a human being, I look really silly and make myself look stupid often. A lot of my reparenting work looks like forgiveness. Can I forgive myself for looking like an idiot, not being able to back into a parking spot in the giant parking lot? Can I forgive myself for saying something stupid to the artist I wanted to impress because I drove out to Brooklyn for 4 hours to see him play, and I had a book of poetry for him, and oh shit, I gave it to him at the wrong time, and now I'm so embarrassed. What am I supposed to do? Well, 12-year-old you would have shut down. What do you need to say to 12-year-old you so she doesn't do that? Can we forgive ourselves for looking silly in front of someone we admire? Right? Like forgiveness is inner child healing. That was a very specific example, and that actually happened last Friday night, and I don't think I need to say anything more about it. We will move on. A lot of this work is both heavy and light, from forgiveness to joy and everything in between. I think most importantly, the concept of reparenting our inner child has to revolve around the concept of positive communication. How would you speak to your inner child in moments of pain? If there was a 5-year-old, an 8-year-old that came up to you in the street and told you what was wrong, how would you respond to them? If an angsty teenage girl, a 16-year-old, sat next to you on a park bench and she was so tired and hopeless, and yet you could see the potential in her, and you could see that she just needed love instead of discipline, what would you say to her? If there's a version of you like that, what would you say to them? A lot of this work revolves around effective communication. Now, I want to touch on something else quickly before we start to close out, and that's the concept of forgiveness. We've talked about it a little now, and as I continue to speak, I recognize I keep talking about concepts of things, not just things, right? Like the concept of reparenting yourself, the concept of forgiveness. And I suppose I find myself speaking in those terms because I don't get to define what reparenting looks like. I don't get to define what forgiveness looks like, feels like, is in action for you. These are concepts that we get to toy with and experiment with and talk about and try on. But ultimately, what these concepts look like in your life is up to you. So I want to touch on this concept of forgiveness and when we talk about reparenting ourselves, when we talk about nurturing these wounds, oftentimes these wounds, especially when we're kids, are not things that we actively picked up and put in our backpack and carried with us, right? Like these wounds, this pain, it's bestowed upon us. And so oftentimes there is someone or something to forgive for giving us those wounds. And if we find ourselves in a space where we are toying with that concept of forgiveness, I want to remind us that forgiveness is not absolution. It's not denial. It's not letting the perpetrator off the hook, right? Forgiveness is for the liberation of the self. And it's almost funny, like forgiveness of someone else almost has nothing to do with them and everything to do with what we're still carrying from them. That forgiveness is a release for us, not a pass for the person who hurt us. And as we move through that concept, that river of forgiveness, there's often a lot of grief that comes up. Specifically, when we're talking about this topic, there's grief that comes up while our parents are still alive. You know, a lot of us as these adult children are reaching levels of awareness much earlier than the past generations. And so a lot of us are understanding these concepts of trauma and inner child trauma and inner child healing while our parents are still like actively alive and well, you know? And so we find ourselves in that duality again as we move through this forgiveness. There's also a lot of grief to move through, a lot of grief to accept, you know, mourning that we may never have that relationship or that dynamic with our parents that we would have liked to have when we were a kid or as an adult. But ultimately, as we move through, you know, this forgiveness and this grief, and, you know, you move through all the stages of grief, eventually we find ourselves in that acceptance. And as we move through all of these hard feelings and we find ourselves into the acceptance of this is what I was given as a child and this is what I have the power to change as an adult, you know, there is great strength and empowerment in knowing that you can rewrite your story. And so as we start to close out here, I'd like to think I did a pretty decent job talking about healing the inner child and not just going off on a tangent about parents. Please bring me your feedback, your comments, your criticism, your questions. I welcome that always, always. But as we start to close out here, I just want to give all of our listeners, and quite honestly myself, a loving reminder here that healing the inner child is lifelong work. Oftentimes, the act of a trauma lasts a few seconds, but the impact of that trauma is what impacts who we become as human beings. You know, dismantling, deconditioning, unlearning, relearning, forgiving, accepting, moving on, all of these things that come with healing the self, healing the younger self, it's a lifelong journey. Be kind with yourself, be patient with yourself, be gentle with yourself. And remember to find joy in this work. Healing is hard enough, man. Sometimes we gotta do something a little silly so we can make ourselves laugh. Find joy, practice joy. Take time to think about what you enjoyed when you were younger or what you would have enjoyed if that opportunity wasn't given to you. Can you give that joy to yourself now? Your inner child, every past version of you and your current version of you, my friend, every part of you deserves to feel joy and safety and goodness in this life. So I hope that this episode has given you some insight, some hope, some encouragement as you continue on your path of self-love and reparenting and forgiveness and all of the things. You know where to find me if you are looking for extra support. You do not need to walk this path alone, my friend. We've got a beautiful community here doing this good work right alongside with you. So thank you, my friends, for tuning in. I hope this sparked something in you. You can always reach out with questions, comments, anything else. And I wish you well. I'll see you on the other side. Thank you.